Welcome, sons and daughters of Newport Beach. Before we get started, though, we'd like to, Howard Hall, could you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Okay, ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. And if we could have a moment of silence for the Newporters who are no longer with us. Welcome. Tonight's going to be a lot of fun. Actually, I call it a sensational evening. When I was at Newport Harbor High School, I developed a fascination with rum runners and gambling ships. And through that, I got to learn about, I don't want to say he's a role model of any kind, but I was fascinated with Tony Canaro. And we're going to learn a lot about Tony tonight. So this is very exciting. This tonight is really it's a Newport story. This is about our city, because we had gambling ships off of our coast, but it's really a Southern California story. And so that's why it was just so nice to be able to partner up tonight with the Newport Harbor Nautical Museum. So I'd like to thank Tom and Rita and Lauren for all of their help. This is going to be a lot of fun tonight. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ernest Marquez, and I think we could call him Mr. Santa Monica. He was born and raised in Santa Monica Canyon, which is a part of the Rancho Bocade Day of Santa Monica. That was part of a Mexican land grant that was awarded to his grandparents in 1839. Now we call him Mr. Santa Monica because his best-selling book, Santa Monica Beach, is really the story of Santa Monica. He's also established a huge collection of artifacts, memorabilia, and photographs of that city. And because out of that interest and all of that effort, this book happened. Noir Afloat is a documentation of our gambling ship history and Tony Canaro. I'd like to introduce Ernest Marquez, our speaker tonight. Thanks, Ernest.
Thank you very much. When I originally started out researching for the history of the gambling ships.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear me? I don't know how to make it. Is this better? When I first started researching the history of the gambling ships, more than 10 years ago, because I could remember as a boy living in Santa Monica when I was in the Boy Scouts. One of our trips was to an old fishing barge that was in Santa Monica, right off the pier, called the Star of Scotland. Well, that ship became, later, in 1938, the Rex. So I felt that I wanted to know more about the ships and who was operating them and why. So I started out. It took 10 years. I ended up with a 750-page manuscript and took it to a publisher, and they said, oh, no, well, this is too much. We have to cut this down. So it was cut down to 250 pages, or less than that. And so a lot of important information is taken out of it. Now I'm here in front of you with a slideshow, and there's only 50 or some slides, so it's cut down even more. So what I'm going to tell you is just highlights, and we'll just go over how the ships started and the names of them and what happened. So, okay? If you want to know more, there's books out there in the front that has that. In 1850, when California became a state in the Union, one of the first laws they passed was the laws against gambling, casino-type gambling. In 1920, the Volstead Act became law, and it was against the law to buy and drink liquor. Bootleggers and rum runners thrived. In 1929, the stock market crashed, ushering in the Great Depression. In 1927, the first gambling ship appeared on the coast off of Venice. The owners thought if they placed their ships beyond the 3-mile limit, they would be untouchable by the authorities. Okay. The 3-mile limit proved to be extremely controversial because nobody really knew where it was. And it was supposed to follow the contour of the shoreline. When it came to bays, that was another matter. Some said it was measured by a straight line drawn from the points connecting the bays, and the 3 miles was limit was 3 miles out from that line. And this argument lasted throughout the whole gambling ship period. From 3 to 6 miles, you were in federal waters, and the federal government did not have any laws against gambling on their waters. The gambling ships created a new industry called water taxis. They took passengers to and from the ships. They were free unless you had a free pass. It cost 25 cents for the round trip. The trip took an average of 30 minutes, and the boats were fast, and they just plowed through the waves. Okay. The first gambling ship was Barge C1. It was a flat-bottom barge anchored off of the coast of Venice. The LA County Sheriffs raided the barge and found roulette tables and poker tables in one of the sheds. There was an article in the local papers about the raid, but nothing was ever done. I think it was a test case to see what the authorities would do. Other gamblers decided to open bigger and better gambling facilities than Barge C1 after they figured the coast was clear. Okay. Joanna Smith was a lumber carrier in Oregon. Her owners were ready to send her to the scrap heap when gamblers bought her. She was the first gambling ship to appear off the coast of Long Beach with a full supply of gambling equipment. Where's Scott? Joanna Smith anchored off the coast of Long Beach, and citizens demanded that the authorities get rid of the ship. Long Beach was founded by the Methodists, and they hated the gambling, and the idea of a gambling ship off their coast just wasn't acceptable. But Joanna Smith thrived and advertised for their gambling ships. They produced these postcards advertising the ship, and they gave them away free so you can mail them to your friends so they could go down there and lose their money. Next. Okay. Next, Scott. Federal agents raided Joanna Smith and seized her for violating the terms of her license. She was registered as for coastwise trade, but she was anchored out offshore and wasn't trading anything. So So they captured the ship. Thanks. Hauled her into Los Angeles Harbor where she sank into the mud. And later she was put up for auction. So when they go back, they had the auction, and the person that won the auction was a show for the gamblers, and they bought the ship back again. and took her out to perform their gambling duties again. In 1932, she was set on fire by a rival gambling ship and burned to the waterline off Long Beach. Now, keep that one there. A mafia gang saw a good thing when they saw it and wormed in their way into the picture. They bought an old sailing vessel called Monte Carlo. She was sailing in the Gulf of Mexico and ran into a storm, and it broke her mast. She lost her cargo that was on the deck and was stranded. So they towed her through the Panama Canal up to San Pedro Harbor, and she was purchased by a group syndicate of gamblers, and they turned her in a gambling ship. The Monte Carlo was run by the mafia. She had a restaurant on the top deck, and all of her gambling casino was below deck where they ran crooked games, and her life came to an end when she was caught on fire and burned to the waterline. The Pacific Coast Steamship Company ran the steamer Rose City from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles. She was sold to a scrap dealer who was ready to tear her apart, and she was rescued by a gambling syndicate and turned into a gambling ship. Next. She was called Rose City. Her original name was Rose City, and she became a gambling ship called Rose Isle. It was given to Clarence Blazer after this ship set the Joanna Smith on fire. The ship later became known as the Joanna Smith II. Next. She had an orchestra on board to entertain the gamblers. Next. Next came the James Tuft. The James Tuft was a lumber carrier. She brought lumber from Washington State to San Pedro. She became a fishing barge, and the place where they sold liquor during Prohibition had stag shows once a month. In case you don't know what a stag show is, they were sex shows with prostitutes. It was raided by the sheriffs and closed down, and after that the owners planned to reopen her as a gambling ship called Casino. But the ship was a wooden ship, and her seams were leaking, and the owners considered her unsafe with huge clouds on board, and they left her anchored offshore with 2 watchmen on board until they had a chance to take her ashore and see if they could fix her. She caught fire and was total loss. The way she caught fire is this: the watchman went down at night to start the generators for the electricity for the ship. the generators were in the same room where they stored the gasoline. And there was a leak in the gasoline tanks. And when he started the generator, that blew up the whole room and the ship burned down. There's a casino burning. Next. By now the gambling ships were getting bigger, and the authorities, not able to close them, they advertised openly in bars and other places. The SS Monte Carlo was an oil tanker. Her hull was made of concrete, and she sailed the coast for 10 years before she was converted into a gambling ship. Okay. She became the Monte Carlo and was considered the biggest and best of the gambling ships at that time. Okay. She had plenty of dice and roulette tables and other forms of gambling. This view is looking forward on the ship. They did give you a free pair of dice if you asked for them. This view is looking aft to see how big these ships were at that time. They were at least more than 1,000 people would go on them every day and gamble and lose their money. She had an elegant dining room, stage for floor shows, and an orchestra for dancing. She had a bar, served every kind of the best liquor. In 1936, the Monte Carlo went to San Diego. She closed for the winter, and 3 men stayed on board as watchmen. New Year's Eve, a giant storm caused her anchor chains to break, and she drifted to the shore. People that came to watch the waves breaking up the casino and gambling equipment came drifting ashore. When the storm ended, the Monte Carlo's concrete hull was broken in half, and there was no way to float her, so she just sank into the sand and is still there in Coronado in front of near the Coronado Hotel. There used to be little signs on the beach saying that there was some kind of danger, there was some obstruction in the sand. But the storms since then have covered her up completely. There's no evidence of it at all. Okay. Truth in advertising meant nothing in those days. Other gamblers figured they could profit by taking passengers out to the federal limit into the international waters and serve liquor and gambling during Prohibition. See the beautiful big steamship there in the advertisement. Go back, go ahead. Yeah. But the ship, La Paya, was, go ahead. Next. Yeah. Didn't look anything like the ocean liner that they were advertising. This vessel had several names, and she was called Panama, City of Panama. She was on a Panamanian registry, and because of that, she could carry liquor in her lockers. This ship would sail out for 6 hours beyond the federal line, and they'd open up the liquor, and people could drink for 6 hours, and they could gamble, and then they'd come back to shore again. For a while, She operated from the Santa Monica Pier. Okay. Harry Dollar, ex-Hans, a German vessel with other idle ships, were tied up at the dock at Alameda. These ships were waiting to be dismantled, or they were no longer useful. Sailing ships by this time are not being used because of the steamships, and so there weren't many sailors that knew how to sail one of those things. None of the gambling ships were built from the hull up to be a gambling ship. All were converted from an already built vessel. The Hans was sold to a gambling syndicate and then taken to San Pedro. Okay. Here, the Tango, after her conversion, her masts and rigging removed, a huge barn-like structure was built on the hull deck. The Tango anchored at sea. It was a big ship and offered every kind of gambling. The interior, this is the interior of the Tango, pretty much like the Monte Carlo. Okay. Tony Canaro, he was known as the king of rum runners, and he later became known as the admiral of the gambling ship P. He was a handsome man and had a colorful personality. After Tony was released from prison for rum running, he promised the authorities that he would go enter an honest profession, and he became a partner on a gambling ship. So he was on the Tango with Clarence Blazer, and Tony was kind of personality and always wanted to be in charge. And he was in a dispute with his partner as how they should run the ship. And his partner wouldn't agree with him. So Tony got mad and he said, let's roll the dice. My share for your share. And winner take all. They rolled the dice, Tony lost. The value of Tony's share was said to be worth $97,000. And that's 1930s money. That was pretty much more than it is worth today. So Tony left the ship with no remorse. He had another idea, and he made his way to Santa Monica, where he had his eye on a fishing barge, Star Scotland. Star Scotland was originally called the Kenilworth and was built in 1887. She worked for the Alaska Packers and was called the Star Scotland. In 1930, she became a fishing barge and anchored off Santa Monica for many years. Tony bought the Star Scotland. He put her in the dry dock and converted her to the gambling ship Rex. Yeah. Rex anchored a little over 3 miles straight out from Santa Monica Pier. She was to become the most famous of the gambling ships. Yeah. Opening night, thousands of people came to Santa Monica Pier to visit the Rex. They had to wait their turn to get out there because water taxi could only carry something like 40 people at a time. It took a half hour to get out to the ship. This is the Santa Monica Pier at that time. Okay. Tony advertised for his wrecks. He wanted everybody to know about his ship. He placed posters in every bar in town. He advertised it in the newspapers and in the sky. Tony began operations May 5th in 1938, 3 miles out from Santa Monica Pier. He was raided on May 13th, 1938, because authorities said his ship was operating in California waters, and Tony disagreed. Court battles continued throughout the summer of '38, arguing over the location of the 3-mile limit. Tony moved the wrecks to Redondo Beach and continued working from there. On March 18th, the District Court of Appeals ruled that Santa Monica Bay was part of the high seas, that Santa Monica Bay didn't exist. So Tony brought his ship back to Santa Monica. Gamblers came back too. They crowded the gambling tables. Pretty women, maybe shills. Women shills were hired to sit at an empty table and play. They were paid $20 a shift. In the meantime, Earl Warren had been elected to office of the California Attorney General. He hated the gambling ships and set out to close them. Since authorities could not do anything about the 3-mile limit, he decided to try another route. He declared the gambling ships a public nuisance. Next. On August 1st, 1939, Earl Warren raided all 4 gambling ships at the same time. The wrecks of the Tango in Santa Monica and the Tango, there was the wrecks of the Texas in Santa Monica and the Tango and the Mount Baker in Long Beach. When they had this raid, they had the deputy sheriffs from Los Angeles. Half of them went to Long Beach and the other half went to Santa Monica, and they timed it so that the raid would go off at exactly the same time in Long Beach and Santa Monica, so nobody could get away, you know. And the ships in Long Beach surrendered almost immediately. The Texas, that was announced near the wrecks, put up a fight, and the wrecks refused, Tony Canaro refused to yield. Okay. On the Texas, authorities stripped the ship of her gambling equipment. They started throwing roulette tables and dice tables over the side, and the Coast Guard came and it said to stop doing that because you're becoming a menace to navigation. The tables and stuff are floating out to sea. So they stopped doing that. They loaded the stuff onto boats, and go to the one before this one. No, before. Yeah. They broke up the tables, and next they loaded the slot machines and other equipment onto boats. Then they took it to the Santa Monica Pier. Okay, next. And unloaded it there. the gambling equipment taken ashore and brought to the Santa Monica Pier, and it was burned to ash. They took it to the dump and set it on fire. No, next. After holding out for 10 days, Tony surrendered to George Contreras, who was the deputy sheriff. Here he is stepping off the boat to the Santa Monica Pier. He said that the only reason he surrendered was because he needed a haircut. He didn't have a barber on board. So after Tony surrendered, authorities went on board and they threw his gambling ship equipment, slot machines over the side, chuck-luck cages, chips, and any other gambling equipment they could find. Here they're throwing over an antique slot machine, probably worth thousands of dollars, went into the sea. No. Here's the Rex. After she was closed up in Santa Monica, she's anchored at Newport Beach. She's in the harbor here someplace. And her superstructure was removed from the deck, and the superstructure became the office building of a used car dealer in Newport. Next. So her hull, all was left was her hull. So her new owners, somebody bought the ship again, and they turned her into a 6-masted schooner. Next. And she was used to haul lumber to South Africa during World War II. In 1942, she was sunk by a German submarine. Next. Meanwhile, back at Long Beach, authorities were raiding the Caliente showboat, the Mount Baker. She had 3 different names. Next. This is the interior of the Mount Baker. Next. They kept the authorities from getting on the board the ship by using fire hoses, and they were spraying them every time the boat would get near, so they couldn't come aboard and serve their summons. They came back the next day and they said, we have authority to come aboard your ship. And we said, we've got the papers here. And the man on board said, who signed it? And they said, well, set a rope down. He tied the summons on it. They hauled it up. He said, okay, you've been served with the summons, so we're coming up and we're taking over the ship. Bunker Hill, no, that was the end of this one. We'll go to this next. After World War II ended, they thought that they had rid the state of the gambling ships. But after the World War II ended, Tony Canaro said, I'm going to bring back the gambling ships. So in 1946, he bought a rusty hull called a Roostook. It used to be a mine sweeper. And before that, she was a steamship called Bunker Hill. And a Roostook was ready to go to the scrap heap. Okay. Tony bought it, brought it to Long Beach, and converted a gambling ship called Lux. The Coast Guard did everything possible to make it difficult for Tony Canaro to go back. to make this ship. They made him follow every single rule to the inch. You know. They asked him, how many people are going to have on this ship? And he told them, he said, okay, you have to have a lifeboat or every one of them. So that's why you see so many lifeboats under. There's the same thing on the other side. There's floats on the top of the deck, all in case the ship sank, if somebody had a wake at all. Okay. Here, the interior of the Lux. You're getting ready now for the grand opening. One wall was lined with slot machines. They had the dice and tables and roulettes on these other ones. People came by the thousands. They could only hold 1,300 people. They were so crowded you couldn't even get near a gambling table. You just wandered around. You know? Next. 11 days after her grand opening, the Lux was raided. Once again, the slot machines were offloaded and ultimately tossed into the sea. The authorities stopped the water taxis from running, so this left patrons stranded on the Lux overnight. They slept wherever they could find a spot. There were no facilities for beds or place to sleep on these gambling ships. So here this picture shows the stranded patrons sleeping in the bingo parlor on the deck. The Lux was towed into the harbor and relegated to a scrap heap. Authorities put her up for auction, and they told the scrap dealer, if you buy this ship, you have to guarantee it'll be scrap in 1 year. And the auction, when the bids came in on the auction thing, they read everyone and inspected it to make sure it wasn't gamblers buying the ship back again. So they sold it to a legitimate gambling scrap dealer. Okay. The Texas was leased to Captain Arnold, who renamed her Star of Scotland. She was anchored in the Bay of Santa Monica. The ship was an old ship. She had been built in the 1880s. Originally, she was a Q ship for the British Navy. Her seams were leaking, and on the night, in the middle of the night in 1942, the watchman on board sent emergency flares into the sky. Santa Monica lifeguard saw it, so they went over to see what was going on. And the ship, a big wave hit the side of the ship, broke open the seam, and the water was pouring into the ship. One of the watchmen jumped over the side. He drowned. The lifeguards were able to get the other two safely. And the ship filled with water and sank. Okay, the next. Here we see two lifeguards and Walter Mondstadt, the owner. And they're looking at the top of the mast of the Star of Scotland as it sits on the bottom of the sea in Santa Monica. The ship is still there, resting on the sea. It's a regular visiting place for scuba divers and fish. And that's So, do any of you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Tony Canaro, was he mafia or was he the independent?
No, Tony Canaro was, he liked to operate by himself. He was the boss, and he wouldn't take orders from anybody. He was Italian. He came over from Piedmont district of Italy when he was 4 years old with his mother and father and brother. He got a brother named Frank. And he joined the Navy when he was old enough, and he didn't like to take orders, so he left. He went AOL, and he became a taxi driver in San Francisco. And by that time, Prohibition was coming in, and he thought, oh boy, this was a good way to make money. So he became a rum runner, and he was smuggling liquor from Canada to California. And he operated that for all through Prohibition. Just, he became everybody knew him. You know, he became what they call a king of the rum runners. Yes.
These ships seem so huge. Have any of them become problems for seamen sailing around them? Or?
No, they're pretty much, they weren't in the, actually the sea lanes or where the merchant ships go. They were just a little beyond the 3-mile limit. So they weren't a menace to navigation.
There's stories about the Monte Carlo coming aground and spilling out all kinds of silver dollars. It seems a little strange that they would have any type of currency floating around during the off-season. Have you substantiated any of those stories?
Well, almost all the gambling ships use silver dollars as gambling chips. Some of them had chips, but silver dollars were easy to handle, and that's what they used. When they raided the ships in 1939, 2 of the ships had so much in silver dollars that they couldn't bring it ashore. It was too heavy. And they had to keep the silver dollars overnight on the ships with a guard to watch to make sure you'd be safe. But that's the main thing. You know, they used dollars for chips. Yeah.
What happened to Canaro after that?
Canaro went to, during World War II, he went to Cuba, and he was trying to get a job with the United States government as a spy. And they refused to hire him, but he was in Havana with his partner. They had gone there to buy liquor because you couldn't get anyplace else, and you could buy champagne in Cuba, so they decided to go get some. They walked into this casino, and Tony said, "Oh, they're operating this all wrong." Yeah, he said, "This is terrible." The guy says, the manager of the place says, "What's wrong with it?" And Tony told him, he said, "Well, why don't you buy it and run it yourself?" He said, "Okay." So he bought the casino, he opened it up, and I'm trying to think of the name of it, and I know the name, and he operated this thing for a while, and Batista was the dictator there. The man he bought the ship from, not the ship, but the casino, was head of the police chief of police. And Tony got it going, and they were making money. And Tony figured he would cater to the middle class, not the high rollers, so that everybody could afford to gamble and lose. You know? And one day the chief of police came in. He said, "Tony, I got something for you." And he handed him 2 tickets to an airplane. And he said, "What's this?" He said, "I'm taking my casino back here, you're going home." And, "Well, when am I leaving?" He said, "Tonight." And so he left Cuba. So then he came to the United States. Tony had a big mansion in Beverly Hills. His mother lived with him. He adored his mother. He went to Las Vegas and opened the first casino in elegant casino in Las Vegas called the Meadows Club. I think it was about 1927, and no, it was 47. Yeah, and it was outside of the city of Las Vegas. It was in the county of Las Vegas. The casino caught fire. The fire engines came and they went to the county line and stopped. They wouldn't, the city line, they wouldn't go into the county to fight fires for some reason. So they put it out with fire hoses, with water hoses and whatever they had. And then after that, Tony didn't like Las Vegas, so he left. And that's when he started the gambling, his gambling ships. And then he went back. That's right. When he went back, after they closed the wrecks, and he started his own hotel and gambling casino. And you know, when you get my age, you get this thing called loss of memory. You know the name, but you just can't think of it. Then when I get home, I'll think of it, and I won't be able to tell you. Stardust. Thank you. He started the Stardust Hotel, and was under construction. He got in trouble with the Internal Revenue Department because he was selling stocks or shares in the hotel without a license or whatever it is you need to sell that stuff with. And he couldn't get a license from for the casino because the head of the license there didn't like him. So he sold the casino part of the Stardust Hotel to another group, which is his friends, to run the casino so his name wouldn't be on it. And then one day he was across the street at the Desert Inn, and he dropped dead of a heart attack at the dice table. His people immediately got a hold of him and surrounded him and wouldn't let anybody touch him. The Las Vegas coroner wanted to come and take him to the morgue. They said, no, you can't, don't touch him. And they called Los Angeles, and the morgue here in Inglewood went to Las Vegas, got his body, brought him back to Inglewood. And he's buried in Inglewood Park Cemetery in the mausoleum of the Golden West, it's called. But nobody really thought that he died of a heart attack. His wife said he was murdered. He said he was poisoned. Some said he went to the men's room and they injected him with something and then he died from while he was at the dice table. But we'll never know because they never performed an autopsy or anything like that. Yeah?
Were there any notorious mafioso involved with the ships?
Yes, the Mon Falcone. You remember that ship? That was run by the Los Angeles Mafia. Mon Falcone. The Mafia gang had helpers or associates with him who were from Chicago, who from Bugsy Siegel and that gang. They were involved with the Mon Falcone. When they raided the ship, they found that the dice tables had a metal table under the belt, and it was magnetic, run by magnets. They made them think the dice stop wherever they wanted to. They had this little cage with dice in it. Was magnetic. Roulette wheels were run by a the same way. If somebody was winning on a certain number, it would make sure it would stop at a different number. So that was fully rigged, and people didn't go out on that thing as much as it did. Tony said his ship was perfectly honest, and he had a proclamation he wrote up. He said he would pay $50,000 to anybody who could prove that they're running a dishonest game. And he told all his workers, he says, don't any of you think that you can get away with cheating, because you'll be floating in the Pacific before you know it. Yeah.
Newport Beach did have some gambling ships off the Newport Pier area, didn't it?
I don't know. I never encountered any in my research that there was any operating out there. They did at Redondo Beach, off of the pier there, but I'm not sure.
Newport had gambling ships out here, because as a little girl, I can remember the lights burning out there.
Do you remember seeing gambling ships off of Newport?
You don't?
Any other questions? I've got one more. Isn't it true that Tony doorbell rang one night in Beverly Hills, and he opened the door, and someone shot him twice in the stomach?
Yeah.
And he never fell. He stood up. What was that about?
Well, that was after the Lux failed. The Lux only operated for 11 days. He was selling shares in the Lux for $4,000 or $5,000. And people would come up to his partners here. Let me have a share in Tony's boat mill. And so we had all these shares coming in. They didn't write them down. And Tony remembered he had a phenomenal memory. He could remember everything, all of his actions, people's names that he hadn't seen for a year. But when the ship failed, they think one day he was in his home having a meeting with a Mexican gambling ship, not a gambling ship, but a Mexican associate of a casino. They want to open casinos in Mexico, and they were talking about that. The doorbell rang. Tony answered the door. There was one man standing there, had a package in his hand, and said, "Tony, we got something for you." And He reached under the package and he had a gun and he shot him. I shot him twice in the stomach. Tony pulled the ground, the man ran away. And this was maybe a short while after Bugsy Siegel was murdered in his house in Beverly Hills. By that time, the chief of police was tired of all these murders going on in his city and not being able to do anything about it. So he told Tony at that time, you got to get out of town and why don't you go to Las Vegas? So that's when he went to Las Vegas. He survived the shooting and was okay after that.
What year was that? Do you recall what year it was?
1948, 1949, somewhere in there. At the end of the Lux went out, right?
Yeah.
Would have been in there much more earlier. Please join me in thanking